Alright, so last time we created this mesh shell, which I still have called cube, so let me just rename that to collider test so it's easier to see. And then this cube is just my I'll call that rigid box. So we created this shell, and I want to go a little deeper on this topic, I think. So right now, this collider test and the prefab are totally separate things. So we've got the original prefab where I took the mesh collider off, and we've got this other object, which is another game object. The Pro Builder scripts don't really change that or anything. But it has its own mesh collider, and it's colliding against itself. But they're totally separate things. So one way, obviously we want these things to be together. So one maybe obvious way would be, okay, I can just take my collider and stick it as a child of this prefab, and then now they'll be together, and I can I could take this prefab with the child in there, and I can make a new prefab. I make that original whatever, and now I can put these guys in, and they always have the collider attached, but they're still separate game objects, which works fine, but it's not really like the normal Unity way of doing things. You'd want it just to be one object and use the components instead. So you have the mesh renderer, the mesh filter, and then here should be a mesh collider or a box collider or whatever. You have the collider on the same object. So in Pro Builder there is a way to do that, and I think it's something that I haven't really done before. So this particular thing I want to do, this tutorial format might be also a little weird, but so I'm gonna record how I kind of figure out, given my existing knowledge of Pro Builder and just how things work, and figure out how to achieve the objective of putting the mesh renderer component or mesh collider component onto this prefab again, this part, and just have it be the one object, and use the lower poly collider model as the mesh collider. And hopefully just kind of seeing me go through the process of figuring out that objective will be helpful. So let me start. Let me just delete this extra prefab one. Wait, that was the original one, wasn't Control Z. Let me delete this extra prefab one, and I don't need this prefab that we made. Yeah, we can delete it. And oh, maybe that was the wrong one. Well, whatever. So we can unpack prefab completely. Now it's not a prefab. It doesn't change anything because it was always just two objects. Let me pull my collider thingy back out. And so we've got two separate objects. We've got one collider object and one model. Okay, so since Pro Builder is, like I said, a modeling program, you can take your object, and then here on the menu there's export, and I'll just click the little plus here. So when you export, you can choose between an OBJ file, which is just like a general model format, STL. I'm not really sure what that one is, or PLY. I assume there are other model formats, and then asset and prefab are things you can export as. And so what I want to do to make this a mesh is export it as a OBJ file. It's just like a normal model file that you can actually open up in other modeling software. Then there's a bunch of different options here. Include children. We don't have any children. Export as a group. I assume that's if there's multiple meshes involved. Applied transforms. Right-handed is already checked. Copy textures is already checked. I suppose I don't technically need the textures because this is going to be a collider, but we'll leave it. Vertex colors, texture offset and scale, and export quads, which is already checked. So I'm just going to go with what's already checked for now and click export. And it wants me to save it somewhere, so let's make a new folder and just call it meshes. And there we go, save it as collider test object. Okay, so what it has done is in this folder I have a MTL file, that's a material file. I have this is the model, the OBJ file, and looks like it exported the texture. So this is that green texture from the material that was assigned. So you could actually create models that and export things out of here with the texturing. There maybe there's probably a texture painting asset, but there are other tools that are better for that. Okay, so let me close that. Close that. So now this is like a normal model file where you have the internal model object, the material, and this is the actual mesh information. Let me look at that. Only 117 verts, 76 triangles, which is pretty simple compared to the other one. Let's look at the other one and select this actual model that goes with it. So this high detail version, 2,420 verts and 1697 triangles and 2 submeshes. So definitely, if we were just using the mesh collider that was applied there, that's a lot more complicated than this other one, which again was only 117. It's very, very small. Okay, so my objective was to add the mesh collider back onto this guy, and instead of using the mesh, the high poly mesh, let's use this the mesh from the collider. So we'll pop that on there, and well, so that didn't quite work because you can see the colliders all the way down here, which is definitely not what we want. Okay, so let's remove the mesh collider again, and let's see if we can figure out why that is. So it was down in the floor. So there's one thing. So the pivot for the object, this is the center place, is way off. It's up here. It's not even lined up anywhere, so I probably should have adjusted the pivot some first. And then this one, its pivot or origin or whatever is over here on the model. So that is where anything in local space to this model would be attached. So that doesn't line up in a very good spot either. Okay, so let's start with my collision mesh. I need to change this so that the pivot, I think, should be kind of on the bottom in between those two posts. That seems like the appropriate place. And so I don't have any geometry in the middle of those to snap it to. So actually what we want to do, make sure that the object is on the origin. And the little transform gizmo is there on 0, 0, 0. So then kind of gonna eyeball it to remember that, but let me move it up. I'll use grid snapping to get it up where I want it to be, and then move it over to where it's kind of in the middle. So this cross right here, I believe, was the origin of 0, 0, 0. And okay, so now you can do freeze transform. It says set the pivot point to world coordinates 0, 0, 0 and clear all transform values while keeping the mesh in place. So the mesh isn't going to move, but we're going to set the pivot at 0. So there we go. So that part looks good. That's kind of how that's how I want the collider to be, and now we have to figure out how to do it with the other model. So the other model is part of the Aquarius Max pack, and so I didn't make it with ProBuilder. So I can't use, when I highlight it, you know, all these most of these things are not available. I can't freeze transform because it's not a ProBuilder object. But it has this handy thing called ProBuilderize. Creates ProBuilder modifiable objects from meshes. Okay, boom. Now it is a ProBuilder mesh. We've got the mesh renderer, looks the same except for it's converted it to ProBuilder mesh rather than the one that it was originally. So now I think I can do the same thing. So let me first move this to 0, 0, 0. The origin is right there. Let me just hide that for now. Why can I still see that shape? That's weird. Let me just move it out of the way then. Okay. So we'll go back here. So this is currently 0, 0, 0 is right here in the middle of the screen. So let me move the mesh so that it gets there in the middle. I think that's the same. Oh, you know what? I have moved this one, so let me reset it. So that is actually a better way, so I can kind of line it up. Of course, my collision mesh isn't perfect. I didn't take the time to really make that good, but so yeah, that roughly lines up, at least close enough. Obviously, I need to spend some more time, making that just a better mesh, but we can do that later. That's not the point of this. So okay, so now this object that has been ProBuilderized, now I can do the same thing, freeze transform. Now its origin is here. And so what we can do then next is well, let's try to set the mesh collider. Let me get rid of this old one. Let me and then we'll export it again. So we'll take the collider test, go to export. We'll export the object file and put it in the meshes folder. Save it. We've got this still low poly version. Now we'll take this, add the mesh collider, and it's currently using its same pro builderized high poly version, and we'll take the collider mesh instead, and it should be using that. Let me get the old collider test object out of the way here, and now we look at this, and it is right where we had it. That, well, at least as good as it was. You know, obviously this is a little off, but you know, you can spend more time actually adjusting the vertices to match up and keep it low poly still. Okay, so now we have a high poly mesh with a low poly collider that is part of that same thing, and we can just take this one and make it a prefab if we want to. And then we can drop in replacements or copies or whatever of the prefab with the mesh collider. Well, that has the same mesh on it. What happened? Looks like it undid what I did. Let me try this again. I'll put the collider test on here. Let me delete this other prefab. And oh, that's strange. So now that I've gone down here into the project and come back up here, the collider tests thingy is gone. So let me put it on there again. There's the collider. Still has that. Drag it down here. It's got the collider test. Okay. Now we will drag one into the scene. And it still has the Pro Builder mesh, so it has, okay. It would seem that the Pro Builder scripts are most likely programmed to automatically, when you have a mesh collider on there, because while you're building it, that is what you want, to put it in there, and so we're not going to be able to override it in that regard. Alright, well, let's see. What if we, let me get rid of some of these extra versions. So we just have the one. Okay. So let's unpack the prefab so that we can delete this one safely and not have it turn red like it did before. Alright, so we've got the mesh collider on here. Let's just remove the mesh collider again. So we've just got this mesh, but it's still Pro Builderized. So we can get it back. let's see if we use the export, and I could make it into an OBJ file, but let's try if we just export it to prefab. And we'll export the prefab. I'll just put that in the meshes folder for now. And now I've got this prefab, and it looks like it's got its own. Oh, it exported the mesh, which oddly enough looks like it has more verts than the other one did. Which was somewhere back in there. I lost the prefab for it now. What is this thing called? Encampment Wall Platform 1A4, right here. So, click on that one. Here's the original. Yeah, 2420, 1697 triangles, 2 submeshes. Versus this one is 3126 verts, 1697, same triangles, and 2 submeshes. That's weird. Okay, but it has my origin fixed, at least, because the pivot point's still down here. Alright, well, so we've got this standalone mesh version exported as a prefab, and while the poly count is higher, which we'll have to investigate that later, let's add the mesh component and see mesh collider, see if that works out. So put the collider test on there, and yes. Now, if I take this, let me just rename this one to with collider. And now, if we make that prefab, make an original prefab with collider, and drag that guy in there. There. Now the collider is with it, and it is one object. So, like I said, obviously the actual collider is not perfect, but I think that that is, at least that particular mission objective is completed. Now we've moved the pivot of the object to an arguably better place. We've got a low poly collider on top of the high poly mesh. And if I grab this rigid box guy over here, let's move it on top, make sure it works. And oh yeah, let's point the camera so we can see what we're doing. Click play. And yeah, there we go. Still works. So that is at least one way to go about adding low poly colliders to high poly models that might come in your various model packs that you get off the asset store. So I think that is pretty handy, and I didn't have to open up Blender or anything, which, not that you know, I like Blender, it's a good program, but we did all this inside Unity while we were potentially working on our worlds. We didn't have to switch context. So obviously I still have a few things to figure out, like why the the mesh became higher poly, and maybe how we can deal with that, and maybe if there's an easier way to just move the pivot. But I think we got the job done, and that's good enough for now. Hopefully you like this format where I didn't really figure out everything ahead of time. I knew a few things, but you got to see some of my process of how I deal with problems as I run into them.